Greetings, my fellow adventurers. It's Elara. Welcome back to our cozy sanctuary, where the flickering firelight and the scent of aged oak fill the air, and the dark and mysterious tales of gods and heroes come alive. Tonight, we journey into the frozen wilds of Skyrim, where the strength of mighty warriors, the ambition of rebellious kings, and the clash between the Empire and the Stormcloaks shape destinies that echo through the ages. So, find your most comfortable spot. Let the crackle of the hearth, the clinking of tankards, and the whispered secrets of forgotten legends stir your imagination, and allow yourself to be swept away into these gripping stories of power, betrayal, and the warriors who fight for their homeland with their swords and wills. Let me know in the comments where you're from and what time it currently is. Let's begin. The tale of Ulfric Stormcloak. In the rugged land of Skyrim, where the winds howl through the mountains and the snow blankets the forests, there was a legend of a man who would rise against the very heart of the Empire. Ulfric Stormcloak, the leader of the Stormcloaks, was a man of fierce will, a warrior whose voice could shake the mountains and whose sword could cut through the coldest steel. But his story, one of rebellion and honor, was not just about the fight for Skyrim's freedom. It was a story about identity, legacy, and the struggle for the soul of a nation. Ulfric's tale began long before he became the leader of the Stormcloaks. He was born in Windhelm, the ancient city of the Nords, a place where history ran as deep as the snow-covered streets. Ulfric was raised as the son of Yorleif, a respected noble of the city, though he never felt fully comfortable in the world of politics and courtly life. He was a warrior at heart, raised on the tales of the Dragonborn and the ancient heroes of the Nords. From a young age, Ulfric was trained in the arts of war, sword fighting, archery, and the ancient shout magic that ran through his bloodline. His early years were shaped by a fierce love for his people and a growing resentment toward the Empire. The Empire, despite its promises, had failed the Nords time and time again. The land was cold, harsh, and unforgiving, and Ulfric's people were as strong as the mountains they called home. But beneath the ever-present snow, the Thalmor, the elven faction that controlled the Empire, began to tighten their grip on Skyrim. The White Gold Concordat, the treaty that outlawed the worship of the god Talos, had been signed by the Empire, and the Nords could not abide it. It was in these formative years, as the political tensions between the Nords and the Empire escalated, that Ulfric made a fateful decision. He would not be content with being a noble in a city full of injustice. He would not sit idly by while the Nords were oppressed and their gods outlawed. So, he left the city and began to wander, seeking the one thing that would define him and his future: honor. Ulfric's travels took him across Skyrim, through its frozen tundras and ancient ruins. But it wasn't until he encountered the Greybeards on the slopes of High Hrothgar that his destiny was truly sealed. The Greybeards, those ancient masters of the voice, the shout magic, had heard of Ulfric's bloodline and his potential. They recognized in him a power that had been passed down through the Nords for generations, a power that had been hidden away by the Thalmor and the Empire. It was there, at the summit of High Hrothgar, that Ulfric learned to harness the voice in ways he never imagined. He was no longer just a warrior. He had become a dragonborn, chosen by the ancient gods. With the shout of power, he could command the very forces of nature. But there was more. Ulfric's shout, born of anger and pride, was infused with the power of the ancient Nords, a magic that could shake the earth itself. He left the Greybeards with a new purpose. Skyrim would not be ruled by the Empire or the Thalmor. It would be ruled by the will of the Nords. Ulfric's voice would be their rallying cry, his shout the battle cry of the free. The seeds of rebellion were planted. Ulfric returned to Windhelm, where he found the city in turmoil. The people were restless, their anger growing as the Empire's presence continued to tighten around their throats. The Thalmor had sent their agents to patrol the streets, and Skyrim had become a battleground in the political war between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion. Ulfric knew that the time had come. It was not enough to fight in the shadows anymore. He needed to give his people a voice, a chance to rise up and reclaim their homeland. He gathered a small group of loyal warriors and began to spread the word. The Stormcloaks were born, not just a militia, but a symbol of everything that Skyrim stood for. They were the embodiment of defiance against an empire that had abandoned its promises and a dominion that sought to erase the Nord's identity. Ulfric's first true test came with the death of his father, Yorleif. The Empire's hand in the assassination was clear, but it was not just a political move. It was an attack on Ulfric's soul. His father's death ignited something in Ulfric, a fury that could not be quenched. His voice became the rallying cry of the Nords, and his sword became a symbol of their resistance. The Stormcloaks grew in number, attracting disillusioned Nords, warriors, and even former soldiers of the Empire who had lost faith in the Emperor's promises. Ulfric's rebellion quickly became a full-blown war. The Empire, under the command of General Tullius, sent its legions to crush the uprising. But they were no match for the fury of the Nords. Ulfric's shouts could be heard over the battlefield, his voice shaking the very earth as his forces stormed through forts and strongholds. Each victory brought more rebels to the cause, and soon the Stormcloaks were no longer just a resistance. They were the hope of Skyrim's future. But the war came with great cost. Ulfric's path was one of bloodshed, and the Nords' war against the Empire and its allies was not without its consequences. Cities were burned, families torn apart, and the land itself began to suffer. As the war continued, Ulfric's resolve never wavered. His people depended on him, and he would not falter. But the battles were not just against the Empire. Ulfric found himself at odds with other factions, including the Imperial Legion, and even some of his own people. Balgruuf the Greater, the Jarl of Whiterun, had hesitated to join the rebellion, torn between loyalty to his people and his allegiance to the Empire. Ulfric knew that his cause could not win unless every Jarl and warrior stood united behind him. As Ulfric neared the climax of his rebellion, the final battle loomed. The Stormcloaks had won many victories, but the war had taken its toll. Ulfric, now a symbol of resistance, found himself facing not only the Empire's legions, but also the specter of the Thalmor, who had long plotted to eradicate the Nords' independence. In the end, Ulfric knew that the storm would only end when Skyrim had been fully liberated, no matter the cost. The final battle took place outside of Solitude, the capital of Skyrim. Ulfric knew that to win, he would have to challenge the very heart of the Empire itself. He led his Stormcloaks against the Imperial forces, fighting with the ferocity of 1,000 storms. His voice rang out across the battlefield, and the skies seemed to echo his battle cry. As the battle raged on, Ulfric found himself face to face with General Tullius, the man who had led the Empire's forces against him. The two clashed, their swords ringing out against each other as Ulfric's voice reverberated through the battlefield. But in the end, it was Ulfric's will that won out. The Empire's forces were driven back, and Skyrim's independence was won. Ulfric Stormcloak had achieved what many had thought impossible. Skyrim was free, but the cost of that freedom had been high. The war had taken countless lives, and the land was scarred. Yet the Nords were free to rule their land, to honor their gods, and to live by their code. Ulfric's reign as Jarl of Windhelm was not without its challenges. His path had been one of blood and sacrifice, and many still questioned whether it had been worth the price. But for Ulfric, the answer was clear. Skyrim would live on, free and unbowed, and that was the only legacy he had ever sought. The storm breaks. The winds howled across the snowy plains of Skyrim as Ulfric Stormcloak stood atop a craggy outcrop, overlooking the scattered fires of his encampment. His eyes, sharp and cold, scanned the horizon. Skyrim was a land full of dangers, and the threat of Imperial legions pressing against them grew with each passing day. But Ulfric knew that the storm he had called would not be quelled so easily. The people of Skyrim had long been subjugated by the Empire's forces and the Thalmor, but now they had a chance, his chance, to rise up and reclaim their home. Tonight, we set the course for a new Skyrim, Ulfric murmured to himself, his breath visible in the frigid air. Beside him, Galmar Stonefist, his trusted second-in-command, stood with his arms crossed over his chest. The two men shared a deep bond forged in battle, their respect for one another unshakable. "We've already gathered the support of half the hold," Galmar said, his deep voice carrying easily across the cold wind. "But not enough. We need to win over more Jarls, or this rebellion will fall before it can truly begin." Ulfric nodded, his gaze fixed on the snowy expanse before them. He had gathered a small army, a group of fiercely loyal Nords who wanted nothing more than to free their homeland from Imperial rule. But they were still a fraction of the forces needed to defeat the Empire, and their strength lay in the people's hearts. As much as Ulfric trusted in his Stormcloaks, the rebellion needed something more: unity. Whiterun would be the key to that unity, and Ulfric knew that gaining control of the city would make or break his cause. The march to Whiterun had been long and arduous, with the Stormcloaks moving stealthily to avoid detection by the Imperial Legion. Their numbers were growing, but every day that passed, Ulfric's anxiety grew. He could feel the tension in the air, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. As they approached the gates of Whiterun, Ulfric and Galmar stopped before the walls. Whiterun was one of the largest cities in Skyrim, its walls imposing, and its Jarl, Balgruuf the Greater, was a figure of considerable power. Ulfric knew that securing Whiterun was vital, but the city was split. Balgruuf had been hesitant to take sides, remaining neutral in the growing conflict, and Ulfric had heard rumors that the Jarl had made covert agreements with the Empire. Ulfric's eyes narrowed as he turned to Galmar. "Balgruuf must be made to see the truth," Ulfric said, his voice grim. "If he does not stand with us, we take the city by force." Galmar grunted in agreement. "Aye, but Balgruuf will not give up his city without a fight. He's proud, and he's got the backing of the Imperial Legion. If we fail here, it will break the morale of the men. We can't afford that." Ulfric clenched his fists. "Then we give him no choice." Ulfric, with his best warriors at his side, entered the Dragon's Reach Hall to confront Balgruuf. The Jarl sat on his throne, flanked by his guards. The tension in the room was palpable as Ulfric and Galmar approached the dais. "Jarl Balgruuf," Ulfric began, his voice deep and commanding. "Skyrim calls for us to unite against the Empire. The Thalmor have taken our gods, and the Empire has abandoned us. This is the time to stand with the people. Stand with your own kin." Balgruuf, a tall man with a grizzled beard and a weathered face, stared down at Ulfric with a mixture of skepticism and cautious curiosity. "You come here talking of freedom and honor," Balgruuf replied, his tone heavy. "But you are no friend of the Empire. I cannot support a cause that leads to civil war in my land. My duty is to protect Whiterun, to keep the peace." Ulfric's gaze hardened. "Peace? Is that what you call submission to the Empire? The Empire that signed a treaty to outlaw our gods? What peace is there for the Nords when their heritage is trampled beneath the boots of men who do not care for our ways?" Balgruuf shifted uneasily on his throne. "I have my people to protect. If I side with you, I risk losing everything." "Everything?" Ulfric's voice rose, his chest swelling with pride. "Your people are already lost, Jarl. They live under the shadow of the Empire, their lives dictated by forces they cannot see. The Nords need a leader who will fight for their freedom. I am that leader." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Ulfric thought the Jarl might relent. But Balgruuf's next words dashed any hope of an alliance. "You are not the leader of Skyrim. You are a madman with a sword and a shout," Balgruuf said coldly. "If you want war, then have it, but not in Whiterun." Balgruuf's refusal to join the Stormcloaks ignited the fury of the Stormcloak army. Ulfric's eyes darkened with the weight of the decision he had made. The storm was now inevitable. As the gates of Whiterun were locked tight, Ulfric called for the attack. "Stormcloaks, for Skyrim!" he shouted, raising his sword high as his warriors charged the gates. The clash was brutal and swift. The Stormcloaks, though outnumbered, fought with the passion and desperation of a people who had been oppressed for too long. The battle raged in the streets of Whiterun, with Ulfric at the forefront, cleaving his way through the Imperial soldiers who stood in his path. The sound of steel clashing against steel echoed through the city, and the air was thick with the shouts of warriors. Ulfric's battle was not only with the soldiers of the Empire, but also with his own heart. He had hoped that Balgruuf would see the truth, that he would stand with his people. But now the city was burning, and there would be no turning back. As the battle wore on, the Stormcloaks took control of the city. Whiterun was theirs, but the cost was high. Many brave Nords had fallen in the streets, and the city was now in ruin. Ulfric stood amidst the wreckage, his sword stained with blood, as his warriors cheered their victory. Galmar approached, his face grim. "We've taken Whiterun, Ulfric, but this will not go unnoticed. The Empire will not sit idly by." Ulfric nodded solemnly, looking out over the battlefield. "Let them come. Let the Empire bring their legions. Skyrim will not be cowed any longer." With Whiterun now under Stormcloak control, Ulfric had achieved a major victory, but he knew that it was only the beginning. His forces would face more battles, more hardships, and more sacrifice. But Whiterun had fallen, and the Stormcloaks had proven that they could strike at the heart of the Empire. Ulfric stood at the walls of Whiterun, staring out at the horizon, his mind heavy with the weight of the future. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Skyrim was at war, and Ulfric Stormcloak would see it through to the end, no matter the cost. The storm intensifies. The bitter winds of Skyrim howled through the forests and across the rugged mountains, the promise of a coming storm in the air. Ulfric Stormcloak stood at the peak of Windhelm, looking down upon the snow-covered city, his thoughts as cold and sharp as the winter winds that swept across the land. The war had been long, and the cost was high, but Ulfric knew that Skyrim's fate would be decided by the next move. The Empire had crushed rebellions in the past, but this time it was different. This time, the Nords were no longer content to live under the shadow of the Empire. The time had come to push for the final victory, to take the heart of Skyrim itself, solitude. As the leader of the Stormcloaks, Ulfric had made countless decisions, some of which had proven to be the right ones, others less so. Every victory had been followed by loss, every triumph by the reality of the cost. The rebels had captured Whiterun, driven out the Imperial forces in the Rift, and reclaimed several strongholds in the north. Yet, the toll on the people of Skyrim was evident. Entire villages lay in ruin, families torn apart, and the land itself seemed scarred by the constant battle. Ulfric's thoughts were interrupted by the heavy footsteps of Galmar Stonefist, his most trusted ally. The veteran warrior approached Ulfric, his expression stern, but with an undercurrent of concern in his eyes. Galmar had stood by Ulfric from the beginning, but even he was beginning to question how far they could push the war. "We've taken almost every hold in Skyrim, Ulfric," Galmar began, his deep voice carrying a tone of warning. "But we're stretched thin. Whiterun, Windhelm, and the Rift. Those are the strongholds we control. But solitude is the Empire's heart. It will be the final battle, but we risk everything if we strike now." Ulfric turned his gaze from the horizon and met his friend's eyes. The fire of determination still burned in him, but Galmar's words were not without merit. A man's ambition could blind him to the cost of victory, and Ulfric had seen too many leaders, too many warriors, consumed by the fire of war. Still, the call for freedom rang louder in his heart than ever before. "We don't have a choice, Galmar," Ulfric said, his voice low but firm. "The Empire will come for us, whether we are ready or not. The Thalmor's influence grows. and they will not stop until they've crushed every last one of us. Solitude is the key. If we can take it, the Empire will know we are serious. Skyrim will be ours. Galmar nodded, but Ulfric could see the doubt in his eyes. Then let's make sure it counts. The Stormcloaks gathered their forces and prepared for the final push to Solitude. The journey south was fraught with danger. As they passed through the mountain passes and into the plains, the shadows of the Empire's legions loomed ever closer. Ulfric's heart burned with the fire of his ancestors. His mind was clear, but the weight of leadership pressed down on him. Galmar and the other Stormcloak generals briefed the men on the strategy, preparing for the assault. The Empire had fortified Solitude heavily, with General Tullius commanding the defense. Tullius was a seasoned commander, known for his tactical brilliance and ruthlessness, and Ulfric knew that they would not win this battle without every bit of strength at their disposal. Tonight, we fight for Skyrim's future. Ulfric's voice rang out to the gathered warriors, his shout resonating through the camp. Tonight, we fight for the Nords. Tonight, we take back our land. The men roared their approval, their weapons raised high. For the first time in months, Ulfric saw the pure resolve in their eyes. They had lost family, homes, and comrades, but they had not lost their spirit. As the sun set over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of red and gold, the Stormcloaks moved into position outside the walls of Solitude. The battle for the heart of Skyrim was about to begin. The first waves of the Stormcloak assault came swiftly, with Ulfric leading his forces from the front. The Stormcloaks had become more than just a rebellion. They were a unified force, their bond strengthened by every battle they fought. The gates of Solitude were fiercely guarded, but Ulfric's warriors were undeterred. With a powerful shout, Ulfric sent Imperial soldiers flying, clearing a path for his men. The roar of the voice echoed through the city, shaking the very walls of Solitude. Galmar and his warriors pressed forward, cutting down the Imperial soldiers with brutal efficiency. The clash between the two forces was intense. The streets of Solitude were filled with the sounds of war, swords clashing, shields splintering, and the cries of fallen soldiers. Ulfric fought with unmatched fury, his blade flashing in the dim light as he carved a path through the Imperial ranks. General Tullius, the man who had once commanded the Empire's forces with cold precision, now faced Ulfric on the battlefield. The two warriors met in a clash of steel, their swords ringing out as they tested each other's strength. Tullius was a skilled fighter, but Ulfric's power was unlike anything he had ever faced. With a shout that sent the earth trembling, Ulfric broke Tullius's guard and drove him back. "You've lost, Tullius," Ulfric shouted as his sword met the general's chest, sending him sprawling to the ground. The battle for Solitude raged on, but the tide of war had turned. The Stormcloaks had breached the city's defenses, and Solitude had fallen. Yet even as Ulfric stood victorious, a heavy weight pressed down on him. His people had been freed, but at what cost? The city was in ruins, its streets filled with the fallen. The price of freedom had been paid in blood. As Ulfric surveyed the battlefield, he saw the faces of his fallen warriors, their bodies scattered across the streets of Solitude. For every victory, there was a loss. The burden of leadership was not just the weight of the crown, but the knowledge that the blood spilled could never be undone. Galmar approached, his expression solemn. "We've won, Ulfric. Solitude is ours." Ulfric nodded, but his eyes were filled with sadness. "At what cost, Galmar? The Empire will return. They won't stop until they've burned us all." As Ulfric Stormcloak stood on the steps of Solitude, the weight of his actions hung heavily on his shoulders. The Stormcloaks had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Empire and the Thalmor would not allow Skyrim to remain free without a fight. Ulfric knew that this was just the beginning. The fight for Skyrim's soul had entered its final stages, and while the Stormcloaks had taken Solitude, the price of the battle was steep. But for Ulfric, the war was not over. Skyrim's future was still uncertain, and the final test of his leadership was yet to come. With the fall of Solitude, the rebellion had struck a decisive blow against the Empire, but the next chapter would decide whether Ulfric Stormcloak would truly be the man to lead Skyrim into an era of freedom, or whether the weight of the war would consume him. As the tale of valor, sacrifice, and the echoes of ancient warriors comes to a close, let the lessons of Ulfric Stormcloak and the Stormcloaks remind us of the delicate balance between power and honor. Remember, my fellow adventurers, that even in the fiercest of battles, the strength of unity and the will to protect what is sacred can guide us through the storm. Thank you for joining me tonight. Until next time, may your dreams be filled with the clash of steel and the cries of warriors, and may new quests lead you to legendary victories. Good night.